Right, so yeah, so let's talk about the A303 Stonehenge bypass. Um, so the point of this project, which at the point that I got involved had been burbling along for over 20 years in various forms, trying to turn uh, the the traffic jams at the A303 from this into this. The idea was to build a two-bore tunnel um, couple hundred meters offset from actual Stonehenge itself and just reroute the road and restore some of the beauty of the landscape and remove pollution, all that kind of stuff. So the project budget is about £2 billion. It would have a burn rate of 30 million a day when fully mobilized, about 2,000 people on site, a huge multi-compound site. It was the first national highways project to gain ISO 27001 and Cyber Essentials Plus. It had a very complicated supply chain that's quite deep, complex operations. Uh, there's nothing like having a project briefing that starts with, "Oh, we've found another dead body," but more of that later. Uh, Generally working at official sensitive in the public sector and with a high risk of physical disruption from protesters who weren't happy with the route and the approach that's been taken through an area of sort of UNESCO World Heritage Site, but also as a critical national infrastructure project, then the risk from nation state actors as well. Oh, and the other thing about the project, I guess I should mention, is that it was cancelled by the new Labour government when they came in. Um, so we were working on it for about a year, and the project entered wind down state and finally closed in January of this year. So now that it's all shut down, I can kind of talk a bit freely about what we learned in the year that we were involved in leading the cyber as it all got mobilized. And there's kind of four things I'll just want to talk about because I think they're kind of applicable to everyone and lessons that we can all kind of learn and apply. One was about cyber culture. We'll talk about supply chain security. And that was kind of really one of the key things that we saw as a risk to the project. Certification is really hard in the public sector, especially when you're doing joint ventures, and so how we worked around that, and some of the challenges around data classification and retention. Before we dive into culture, just to give you a bit of background around where we saw some of the threats coming from. So what were we trying to defend against? As I said, the idea is when the project was fully mobilized, it was going to be spending about £30 million a day. And a lot of that was going to be the big tunnel boring machine that literally had to keep on running non-stop without any interruptions in order to stay on time and stay on cost. And so in a world where you're not thinking about data loss particularly, probably the biggest threat was just trying to stop the operations on site. So how a cyber attack could affect the real world. For example, the multi-million-pound tunnel boring machine, if you could shut it down because you could hack one of the little rainwater sensors that it was relying on fitted through the ground to make it think that there's a flood, and so it was no longer safe to operate, then that would be very disruptive to site. In a large multi-compound environment, a dangerous working environment interspersed through military compounds as well down on the Salisbury Plain. It's very important that they knew where everyone was at any given time for health and safety reasons. There were 2,000 people on site. If someone had an accident, you need to know who was where, what was going on. So if you could hack the security gate system so that people's swipe cards didn't work, so they couldn't come onto the compound, suddenly you would shut down operations and things like that. So that was a lot of the focus that we had is how could we stop cyber attacks impacting OT and impacting kind of operations because of the huge cost that would have, and it would be extremely visible. So let's talk about culture. So the A303 project was a joint venture. So there was a couple of big, what they call tier one contractors who were all engaged by National Highways with a bit of the project to do. So there was someone in charge of what's called prelims, which is kind of getting the ground ready. There was someone in charge of digging a tunnel. There's someone in charge of building the road and so on. Um, and these are all large, multi-million, multi-billion pound organizations. So they had their own cyber culture. Everyone was bringing their own corporate device. The actual uh, project itself had 40 computers that it owned. And most of those were large Microsoft Surface devices in meeting rooms at the headquarters. So when we talk about cyber culture, it's about how do we get people coming from their own environments with their own corporate laptops and their own security awareness training and their own security policies and try and build an um, integrated culture. And one of the things that we need to do is make sure people realize that this is a team sport and that when they're turning up at the A303 offices or working on the A303 project, they are part of Team A303, not part of um, their home mothership, if you like. So they need to adopt our policies, our procedures, our way of working. So it won't necessarily be the same as when they're back at home. We also wanted to work on an approach to cybersecurity that kind of mirrored the journey the construction industry have been on with regards to health and safety over the last 10 or 20 years. If you'd walked onto a building site maybe 20 years ago and talked about health and safety, people would have kind of rolled their eyes and said, for goodness sake, we've got a job to do. Stop being silly with all this fluorescent underpants rubbish, right? Whereas today, health and safety is kind of core to what everyone does. Before you start work, there's a health and safety briefing. Every time there's a meeting of any kind, there's a health and safety moment, and it's kind of really embedded in the culture. So what we were trying to do is to drive the same kind of transformation and approach for cyber culture that we'd seen health and safety, to the point that when we talked about safety within the project, it might be physical safety in the real world, or it might be cyber safety. But safety was safety was safety, and cyber was just part of that culture. So, and part of that was we wanted people to report smoke, not fire. Wanted to report near misses in the same way that they would from a health and safety perspective. Help people to understand what does risky look like from us through a cyber lens, so that they could be aware and report it. And it's not just about sending, um, you know, phishing test emails. It's about getting to think about cyber safety in the context of the real world threats that we were talking about earlier. And lastly, we had to get people to understand what the rules were. You can't follow the rules that you don't understand. So, given that this was the first national highways, critical national infrastructure project to gain ISO 27001 and Cyber Essentials certification, what does that mean for the way that you work? What things are changed in the way that you need to think about stuff and the way that you need to plan about stuff? Um, and this was kind of one of the key areas that we had a lot of work to do because people just didn't understand the implications of those certifications that they had on the way that they work on a day-to-day basis. So the way that we went about building this integrated cyber culture, first of all, everyone who joined the project went through a cyber induction as part of their onboarding and as part of their health and safety briefings as well. Cyber was there as part of that. We had monthly bulletins that went out to everyone on the project. They were by email. There's a SharePoint site that had them all on. There was digital signage all around the project infrastructure that had cyber stuff on there as well. And we did bespoke training for the board and the operational leadership team. So these are the people responsible for setting the strategy and implementing the strategy across all aspects of this what was in effect a £2 billion revenue business. So kind of getting those people on board and understanding what the risks are, how should they be behaving as a result. So let's talk about supply chain then. So often in the world of cyber data protection, we talk about PII and we have to protect PII. Well, in our world, PII meant procurement in ignorance. And one of the big problems that we had is coming into a project that had been burbling along for, as I said, 20 years before it really started to pick up steam. There was a lot of contracts that were already signed with, very key players, multi-million pound contracts. And even though the top level, engagement contract from National Highway said you must be ISO 27001 compliant, you must be Cyber Essentials compliant, the implications of that didn't filter down through into the people doing the procurement for other projects. And so the sorts of things that are incumbent upon you if you're operating in an ISO 27001 compliant manner weren't built into the contracts that they had already signed. And so there were no requirements for cybersecurity. There was no cyber due diligence being done on any of the suppliers that were being brought on. And so we were in a position where we need to go and start evangelizing a way of working that was all carrot and we had no stick, because these suppliers already had a contract. And what we were trying to avoid is them turning around to National Highways and saying, "Oh, well, if you want us to add security, then that'll be an extra £1 million," because that's the way it works in construction. Any excuse to put in a variation order. So I think that's kind of a key learning for I think anyone working on a big and complicated project, is to make sure that the procurement team understands the implications of the cybersecurity frameworks that you're working to, especially if you're working to a standard like ISO or Cyber Essentials. And what does that mean from a procurement perspective, and how does that impact the due diligence process, so that you can get involved and talk to suppliers about the way they're behaving before the contracts get signed, so you've got an opportunity to influence what's going on. So when we started putting together a due diligence framework for the supply chain, yeah, you remember we were spending £30 million a day when this was fully mobilized. So how do you work out from a cyber perspective what is appropriate? Initially, we took the view that, well, the risk has got to be related to the amount of money that you're spending, right? Because you must be spending a lot of money with suppliers that are key to your operations, and not spending very much money with people who are not key to operations. So that was our original framework, to say, based on the annual spend with a supplier, that would impact the sort of cyber certifications that you wanted. Remember, there's not a lot of personal data floating around here. There's not a lot of private information. What we're really interested in is protecting the project from an interruption to physical operations. So we're making sure that ransomware doesn't stop a supplier's computers from working, and so they just don't turn up for work one day, things like that. So that was our kind of initial approach, and then kind of talking that through with the program management team and the people who are kind of managing the risk to the other project. They said, well, actually, the money we spend isn't always directly proportionate to the risk that the supplier places to the project. And so we had this second lens. So it's how much money we're spending, and how much of a risk are you to day-to-day operations if you just didn't turn up tomorrow. And so by applying both of those with a very simple formula, we said this is a low-risk supplier through to a high-risk supplier. And then we use that to say, okay, all things being equal, this is the cyber certification we would want to see you have in place. And that was then provided as a recommendation through to the procurement people and the project managers, so they can make an informed decision about whether or not they wanted to work with that supplier, because they understood the risk. So let me kind of give you an example for that, in terms of who would you imagine would be the highest risk supplier to the £2 billion tunnel project. Actually, it was the company that supplied the fleet of lorries every day full of concrete. If those concrete lorries stopped turning up, that would be the biggest impediment to operations. I wouldn't have guessed that. I would have thought it'd be something else, the big complicated tunnel boring machine or something else. But that was the thing, because if they would be using so much concrete every hour, as this kind of tunnel machine was basically, it digs its way through the soil, and it concretes the walls as it goes along, kind of thing. Everything stops if the concrete lorries stop flowing. And if the concrete lorries stop flowing, how could that happen? Well, if they're If their computer systems go down, they don't know what lorries are supposed to go where and what concrete is supposed to be delivered to who and what type of concrete it is, right? And so suddenly you're in a situation where actually we need to have at least Cyber Essentials Plus certification for the bloke who delivers the concrete, because if his computer stopped working, it would have a massive impact on the operations. And actually, the way these things work, there's not that many concrete lorries in England. So actually, you've got lots and lots of suppliers all delivering this in an integrated way. It's not just one big contract. And just to give you a kind of a real world example, that the project was already in kind of closed down mode in the run up to Christmas, but we then found out that their third biggest supplier by spend was completely wiped out by ransomware in December 2024. So, and that was someone who we'd flagged as high risk, who weren't even Cyber Essential certified at that point. And, it just kind of brought it to home how close to the winds people were sailing because of these signed contracts that didn't have any of this cyber protections built in. And although they had agreed to a plan to retrofit, had the project actually not been in shutdown mode, that would have been a very significant and costly impact. So you'll just talk about certification challenges a little bit. As I said, this was the first scheme to have ISO 27001 and Cyber Essentials certification for national highways. And the problem is, in these kind of big public sector projects, there is often no legal entity. There's a framework of contracts that have been signed by a government quango or national highways. So there was no A303 limited. And if you're familiar with the world of cybersecurity certifications, you certify a legal entity, you don't certify a project. So who are we issuing the ISO certificate to if we need to certify the project? And whose name is on the Cyber Essentials certificate? So in the end, after lots of backwards and forwards, involving the compliance team at UCAS and that kind of stuff, it was agreed that the lead contractor for the digital and cyber work stream, which was who we were subcontracted to, they would be the holder of the ISO certificate, the Cyber Essentials. And it would be the scope of something like it was Mindcraft Limited working for National Highways to deliver the A303 Stonehedge bypass tunnel project. That was kind of the scope and everything that kind of sit underneath it. But an interesting distraction and a lot of time was burnt just trying to work out who to issue the certificate to and how to make it work within the concept of the schemes that are just not designed to certify a project. They're always looking for a legal entity that they need to certify. So one thing that didn't go well was the whole of data classification and retention. That you would not believe how much paper was generated and how many documents were generated, especially over the life of and that was running for years. A big and complicated project. And because years ago no one had kind of tackled the beast and said, we need to start classifying our documents, we need to start defining data retention rules. By the time we got involved, that the backlog was 1.2 million documents and emails were already existed in the project. And how would you classify those? And although there was kind of broad agreement from the leadership team, yeah, we should probably do something about it. No one really had the stomach to work out how to enforce it, which really came back to bite them in the bum when our dear new chancellor cancelled the scheme. And suddenly they had to work out which of these 1.2 million documents needed to be retained and destroyed as the project was closed down, and what had to be handed back to National Highways and what was secret and what wasn't, and all that kind of stuff. And in the end, the answer was, we're going to give all 1.2 million back to National Highways. It's your problem to sort it out. And that's what happened. So certainly a lesson learned for anyone is when you're involved in a project, it should be a month one activity to define your data classification retention rules, get them implemented, get them enforced. If you're in a Microsoft 365 tenant, like we were, get all that turned on within 365. You can always tweak it later, but if it's there, you've got something as a basis to work on. So some of the things I wasn't warned about before I joined the project. So first of all, there was all the dead bodies. So one of the side effects of the place where the project was operating, so it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. There'd been people living and working on that Salisbury Plain for thousands of years. And so as soon as you start digging in the ground, whether that's like a test borehole or laying some electricity for a compound, not only are they finding archaeology, but they're finding dead people. And it was a not infrequent briefing update on the daily project huddle to say, oh yeah, we found another dead body. And the process was something like, is it over 100 years old? If it's under 100 years old, they have to stop everything and call the police. If they're happy that because there were staff archaeologists, at every location, if they're happy that it's over 100 years old, then the archaeologists take over and they work out whether they're either going to kind of remove it in a way that's been agreed, or they have to reroute the works. I've also never been in a briefing where there's a regular discussion about how does King Arthur Pendragon feel about what's going on. So King Arthur Pendragon is I guess the official name of the leader of the Druids in the UK. And so because we're working in the Stonehenge area and there was kind of some controversy around what this is doing to the landscape, then what King Arthur was doing and saying was quite frequently discussed because he was able to pull the levers on the actions of physical protesters and whether they would turn up to site and cause problems and all that kind of stuff. So it was just a little bit surreal on a number of occasions to be talking about what King Arthur thought about what was going on, especially when that came straight after, yes, we found another dead body. What does King Arthur think about it? And the protesters were revolting as well. Yeah, obviously there's a debate to be had about all of these kinds of things, but I think for me it was the first time where the threat of physical violence was what cybersecurity was there to do. I remember when I took my CISSP qualification. I remember just pondering one of the things that they talked, that was kind of one of the required elements of what's the point of cybersecurity? Yeah, the chief aim of cybersecurity is the preservation of human life. That's what it says in the IC squared syllabus. And I think for me this was the first time actually that came into focus to say, yeah, I could see the interaction between what goes on in cyber and what goes on in the real world and what the impact that has to people's physical safety. And that's the end of what I had to say.